Hey everybody, welcome back to Tenta Outdoors. My name is Al Tenta. I'm a contestant on this season 10 of Alone. Last night was episode 3. This video, I'm going to do a full recap of all the stuff that went down. Stick around. So episode 2 ended with Mikey in a lot of pain, in his shelter, and vomiting. And they cut to the end of the episode. Episode 3 began with Mike still in the shelter, making it through the night, suffering through. He was sick, he was throwing up, dry heaving, felt terrible. But in the morning, he's recovered. He's feeling a lot better and his nausea is gone. And he was awoken by a good dream he had about his son. Mikey revealed that it's his birthday and talked about how his wife always does something special for him on his birthday, whether it's a card, a small gift, just something that makes him feel special. Mikey tells the audience that he's no longer feeling nauseous, grabs his bow, and goes out foraging. He harvests some blueberries, sees a grouse, misses the first shot, but gets it on the second and finds it quite easily. So what I liked about this scene is that, in Mike's mind, that was a gift from his wife on his birthday. This was his first birthday since he's been with his wife that she wasn't there to celebrate it with him. So the first shot that Mikey took on that grouse, it led us to believe that he lost that arrow, so he went to work making another one. And he grabs a piece of alder and goes to work. He found a really cool rock with a nice dish shaped in it to help scrape the bark off his arrow. And he asks us not to judge him for making his arrow because he's never done it before, but it appeared to me like he was doing a really good job with shaping it. And he kind of sends a message out to the audience that be aware of people, adults and children alike, with autism that have a hard time dealing with loud noise, and just be respectful of that. So I was up next in the episode and they showed me beginning to construct my permanent shelter, which was a teepee. I was lashing together my tripod, which was the beginning of my permanent shelter. So they showed me eating alder cones and birch bark fungus. Now it's not that great tasting, but it gave my stomach something to work on because I was worried that my stomach, if I didn't eat something every day, that my stomach would lose some of its ability to effectively digest food. So I was munching on those bad boys. Did they taste good? No. Was my body able to digest them very well? Not really. I won't go into details, but I mean, it gave my stomach something to work on and it kind of helped with my feeling of fullness. So I hadn't caught a fish in about 6 days, so I did set up a whole bunch of small game snares on what I thought were rabbit trails or old rabbit trails. And I wasn't seeing a lot of rabbits. I hadn't seen any sign of rabbit in my area, but at orientation camp, there were rabbits everywhere. So I was hoping I'd be able to catch a rabbit in one of my snares. So I wanted to keep my shelter small, cozy, and simple, and I didn't want to expend a lot of calories building it. So all the trees I needed to build that teepee were very close, and there was a huge layer of moss also right beside my teepee. So I didn't have to do a lot of packing and carrying, like everything I needed was right there. I want to talk a little bit more about that site that I chose. It was kind of in a little dip. I don't know if they showed it very well, but it was in a little dish. And I was surrounded by really thick trees, and I chose that area because I knew that it would be shelter from the wind. And it was also very close to the beach. So I have to give credit to the Cree elders that I met at orientation camp. So I had a conversation with one of the Cree elders, and I said, what kind of shelter would you recommend? And he recommended a teepee. So I give a lot of credit to those Cree elders at orientation camp for influencing my decision on the type of shelter that I was going to build for this experience. I also want to speak on the time frame of that shelter. Now, it made it seem like I built that shelter really quickly. It didn't take me too long to build, but that was actually over 3 or 4 days. So I'd build the frame and I'd moss about a fifth of it, maybe a quarter of it every day. So I think on the 5th day I had it finished. But I never worked on it all day. I always worked on it for a couple hours because I wanted to spend as much time fishing as I could. So the tarp that we were given didn't even come close to covering up my teepee. So my plan was just to put it over the area where I made my bed. So that moss was almost totally waterproof. When it rained, there was a few drips through the moss, but I made sure that where I was sleeping and I kept all my clothing was under the tarp section. But I would say the other part of the teepee was maybe 90% waterproof. Just a few drips would come through. So they showed me completing the shelter, but it wasn't actually completely completed. I hadn't built a door yet, and I hadn't put any reinforcing material on top of it, which I did a few days later. The next scene showed me checking my snares, and there was a very angry pine marten in one of my snares. we are not allowed to trap pine marten. So I wasn't allowed to dispatch it. I had to release it. And it was still very much alive. So I was nervous at first. I'm like, what am I gonna do with this guy? So I put on my gloves and I got my winter jacket to throw over him. And I got my Leatherman out and I was able to snip off the snare wire. He had been rolling and twisting for quite some time, so he was really entangled in the snare wire. But I was able to cut him free and he took off. So the pine marten ran away with the noose still around his neck, but there was no force on it whatsoever, and it was just a loop with the snare wire through it. So he would have been able to just pull it off really easily. So I managed to release him without much trouble. I didn't get bitten or scratched or anything. I just snipped off the wire and off he went. So after that experience with the marten, I decided to take down the rest of my snares. Now, some people might think I'm crazy for doing this, but I had seen no rabbits and no sign of rabbits, and I'd seen a lot of martens and a lot of marten sign in the area. So I didn't want to catch another one. If I did catch another one, I would have had to go through the whole procedure again, or it would be dead and I wouldn't be able to eat it. So I took them all down and I was going to wait until the snow flew so I could see if there were rabbits and where they were moving, and I would set up my snares then. And I was just going to concentrate on fishing. Seeing that marten in the trap, it was kind of alarming and it hurt my heart. I didn't like to see the animal suffering and frightened like that. I mean, he was just trying to go about his day, getting some food, and that snare kind of ruined his day. So I did not want that to happen again. So they came back to me a little bit later on the episode, kind of a silly scene of me. I wasn't sure if they put this on the show or not. I was just kind of fooling around, being silly with my new shelter, pretending that it was a winter cottage that I'd purchased, and I kind of gave a tour. I talked about the walk around yard, the exterior with moss and spruce overlay, the living floor, and my fave, skylight. And I kind of made a joke about how I couldn't get fire insurance. Why? Really, I wasn't losing my mind, I was just having some fun. So the next scene showed me discussing how the fishing when I first got there had been very good. The first 3 nights I caught a fish, just fishing for 5 to 10 minutes every night. I caught 2 pike right off the bat, and then I caught a lake trout. And after that 3rd day, I fished tons. I fished for hours, and I was getting the odd bite, so I knew there was still hope, but I didn't catch a fish for 6 days, and I was starting to get a little bit concerned. So fishing appeared to be getting a little bit better because I was getting the odd bite, and I'd seen a pike following my lure in. And eventually I just kept grinding, I kept fishing and catching, ended up catching that 5-pound lake trout. And man, that was the most exciting fish I've ever caught. I mean, obviously if you watch the episode, I let out a couple victory screams, a couple of hoops and hollers, and I actually even got a little bit emotional when the fish was up on the shore, because man, when you haven't eaten in 5 days and you know you have 3 days of food, because half of that fish, that's a pretty good meal. And you saw how fat it was as well. It was full of roe, and I ate that too. And as I'm getting hungrier, it's getting easier and easier to eat that roe. So I talked about a fillet one day, a fillet the other day, and then the head and carcass that I make soup out of. Now, I want to talk a little bit about that. I mean, the fillets were awesome, but on the 3rd day, what I do with the fish, I'd stick the head and the bones and the bit of meat that were left on the bones in my pot, and I'd boil it, and I'd boil it, and I'd boil it till there was nothing left of the head. It was just mostly bone. Even the bone was starting to dissolve. I drank the fluid, I drank the liquid, so all the oils and calcium and fats were in that broth, and man, I felt so good after eating that broth. It really was amazing, that fish soup that I drank. So next up on the episode was Cade. So Cade finds an old wasp nest and he goes, hey, this is gonna be awesome fire starter. And I love the way he utilized natural resources he found to make his life easier. Because starting fires with a ferro rod without the proper tinder can be a bit of a pain. So Cade was also not having any luck with snares, so he decided to set his sights on building some new arrows to replace from the quiver that he lost off his bow in the previous episode. He says, if I can't hunt, I can't win, and he's gonna fight it out as long as he can. So he makes some really impressive arrows, fletched with grouse feathers and fishing line, and he makes a small game blunt out of what appeared to be snare wire. So after Cade constructs that arrow, he sets up a piece of bark which simulated a grouse in the tree, and he nails it on the first shot. He's back in the game. So as Cade was working on his second arrow, he heard another grouse. He went after it and was able to make a good shot and harvest it. The next scene showed Cade making a different fire pit away from the beach. So while he was eating this grouse, on his beach fire pit. He was feeling really good. He overcame adversity, he created new arrows, he solved his problem. So on the way back from his fire pit where he was eating his grouse, going to his new fire pit in the bush, he realized that it had spread in the root structure and the moss underneath the ground, and he had like a mini forest fire on his hands. Luckily, he had found that big white bucket and was able to put it out fairly quickly. He said he put about 100 gallons of water on it. So next up, I want to talk about Lee. They show him drinking a pot of birchberry soup, and they went on to discuss it has about 80 calories in it, which isn't a lot because, well, a person my size anyways needs about 2,500 calories per day to survive. So, well, not to survive, but to not lose any weight. So 80 calories, even though it will make you feel better and it will give you some energy, 80 calories isn't a lot of energy. So this scene really focuses on Lee building a trapper-style cabin. And he goes on to say, you know, even though I'm not catching fish, I still need to create this cabin to make it through the winter and stay warm. He explains how he's going to work on it a little bit each day so it doesn't totally wear him out. So this scene, Lee really spoke a lot about his father. He discussed how him spending time in the woods really helped him to understand his dad. And he described his dad as a mountain man who spent all his time in the bush. And that now he feels like he's following in his dad's footsteps. So he's really only surviving on berries and vegetation, but he's excited because he's almost finished his cabin. So Lee finishes up his cabin, putting moss on the roof and builds a door. His cabin is complete and he's moving in. So on day 18, they show Lee lying in his cabin. It's in the middle of the night. He can't sleep. His ears are ringing and he's obviously feeling the effects of starvation. His head's pounding and he knows he just needs food. Lee went on to talk about how coming into the competition, he didn't have enough reserves. He wasn't able to gain enough weight to go through these sorts of periods of no food. He wakes up in the morning, he checks his gill net. Unfortunately, it's empty, and he doesn't think he has enough energy to hunt. He alludes to the fact that perhaps he spent too much time and energy working on his cabin. Unfortunately, Lee taps out. Lee went on to say some really emotional words, some really wise words about life in general and his path, the journey that he's been through in his life. Whew. I shed a tear. Yeah, and he just basically said that he really appreciates what his father went through. So next up we have Anne. So they show Anne doing some laundry, which kind of made me think, it's like, I never washed a single thing when I was out there, and I guess I was pretty stinky. So Anne goes on to talk about how she feels the best when she's out in the woods, and she compares it to going to church. So Anne discusses how she's struggling to find food, but her luck changes when she's able to harvest a grouse with her bow. As she's plucking and preparing her grouse to cook, she hears a noise. She heads down to the water and sees a large bull moose swimming across the channel to the other side. So unfortunately, the moose is too far for a shot. And then after the whole moose experience, she kind of says, well, if I do get this moose, it's going to take me a long time to prepare it and skin it and process it, and she's wondering if she actually does have the energy to do that. Anne talked about how all her mom really wanted her to do was finish college, but Anne chose a path of farming and following her true passion instead. So after the whole moose experience, Anne believes that she might be able to lure that moose back in her area with some cow calls. So after Anne does a few cow calls, she sits down and she's feeling quite ill. Her heart's racing, and she alludes to her fear of having a heart attack. And she mentioned her mom had a heart attack when she was about her age. She's feeling absolutely terrible, and she heads back to her shelter. She talks about how her mind is still in the game, but her body is failing her. This is quite an emotional scene, but Anne makes the decision to tap out. So she was the second person to tap out in this episode. The last person they featured on episode 3 was Luke. Luke is absolutely slaying it out there. He's caught 11 fish, he's not hungry, and he makes reference to his guts being full of fish. He's also harvested a ton of blueberries, he's cooking them down in his pot, and he's drying them into like fruit leather cakes with special gaiters that he designed specifically for that purpose. I actually want to try one of them. They looked really good. And the flavor of the blueberries out there were like so explosive. Like they're so much better than the blueberries you get in the store. It's like a flavor explosion. So Luke wants to have 2 shelters. He wants to have one by the beach and one further away from the beach, more protected from the elements and the wind. He wants to create what he calls a bear den, and he begins digging out the earth to create his bear den style shelter. And he gives a lot of credit to his father for teaching him the skills that he's utilizing in this situation. Thanks for sticking around and checking out my recap. Don't forget to tune in next Thursday night for episode 4 of Alone. My name is Al Tenta. This is Tenta Outdoors. We will see you next time.